Hiya. How are you this morning? Good? Okay, I see some nods. I've been a member of this church for 33 years. At different points in the past, I've been on staff. I've acted as the volunteer choir director, president, the chair of the Religious Education Committee. I'm almost always a teacher in our religious education program, and currently I'm in my second year as co-chair of the worship committee, and my first year on the Committee on Shared Ministry. I sing with our choir. I often start sermons with a story, and this one is no different. I'd like to start with a version of a story told by Jesuit priest and psychotherapist Anthony DeMello. He begins, "One evening, the whole family went out to dinner at a local restaurant. Everyone got a menu, even the youngest, Amy, who was 6 years old. Since the conversation was an adult one, Amy sat there ignored. The waitress came up to take their orders. When she came to Amy, she asked, 'And what would you like to eat, young lady?' Amy answered, 'I will have a hamburger, French fries, and a large Coke.' 'No,' said her mother. 'She will have a small salad with low-fat dressing, baked chicken, carrots, and boiled rice.' Then her father chimed in, 'And milk to drink.' The waitress looked at Amy and asked, 'Would you like ketchup or mustard on your burger?' Amy said, 'Ketchup with some fried onions, and put a small piece of lettuce on the burger to please my parents. Thank you very much.' The waitress walked away to place the order, and Amy turned to her family and she said, 'You know what? She thinks I'm real.' How many of you ever felt that you weren't being listened to at a time when it was important to you? Have you had an experience similar to Amy's of being listened to by that one person after being disregarded by lots of people? Do you remember how you felt? Maybe like you were real, or like you mattered, or as if you were being validated in some other way? I've had both experiences, being listened to intently and being disregarded by someone important to me, and I definitely prefer the former, pretty much for the same reason that Amy gave. There's quite a lot to learn from people who are remembered as very fine listeners. People noted for their listening skills occur in several different settings. They include American psychotherapist Carl Rogers, who pioneered person-centered therapy, and the Austrian philosopher and educator Martin Buber, best known for his book, I and Thou. It was said of both of them that they were exceptional listeners. They gave their attention wholly to any person with whom they were talking, and they sought to understand the perspective of that person fully. Buber spent most of his adult life in Germany and Israel. He was born into an economically comfortable, well-educated family with wide-ranging interests and influence outside the family. He spoke and or read something like 8 languages and was deeply involved in the politics of his day, in the revival of Hasidic Judaism, and in adult education. For a time, in defiance of Nazi orders, he held adult classes in Jewish identity and history in Germany. Eventually, he fled Germany to Israel, where he taught at the university level for most of the rest of his life. He is best known for his book, I and Thou. In German, that's Ich and Du. There is a detail encountered in the translation of that title that I want to discuss a little right now. You see the slide that's coming up? Ich, the ICH, is the German word for I, this person. Es is German for it, and du is German for you. German, unlike English, makes a distinction between the singular and the plural forms of the word. Du is singular and also informal. A child in school would never address their teacher as du. They would always be sie, which is the formal word. Maybe if they ran into them a little bit later on in life when they were both adults, but never when they're classmates. Du is for friends and your classmates. Now, Buber was definitely a theist. He believed very strongly in a personal God deserving of worship who was a regular presence in human life, but he doesn't suggest that everybody needed to feel the same way. The fact that the translation of the German word du is thou in English versions rather than you, I believe tells us more about the translator's perspective than it tells us about Buber's belief system. I took some German in college, and I've sung in it for most of my adult life, and I have never heard the suggestion that du means anything but you. Despite what the word thou might suggest, I don't think that any particular belief in God is necessary to understand Buber's philosophy. He does talk about the applications of his I, it, and I-you theory to ideas about spirit later in his book, but it's clear that spirit is only part of his thinking. Buber was better received by Christian theologians of his time, more so than the Jewish community. He was a little dismissive of a legalistic stance toward religion. He didn't like strict rules. He preferred an emotional, expressive approach, and perhaps this alienated some Jews. That community, after all, was under more and more pressure during this time, and they may have been inclined to define themselves according to rules because that's what people and communities do. They tend to establish very tight boundaries when they're under a lot of pressure. And Buber was absolutely a rule breaker. He disdained systemization and any pretense of objectivity, finding that both could become rigid and mechanical. He was all about seeing the individual and acknowledging the important differences between one person and the next. So I recommend that you take the translated thou very lightly and consider it more likely to be I-you. I will refer to the philosophical idea of the difference between an I-it relationship and an I-you one, where you are more likely to have heard I-thou, and now you'll understand why I chose the words that I did. One more caveat. Buber uses the word man to refer to all human beings, a fairly common practice in his time. However, it is clearly a very outdated and factually incorrect practice, given what we know about the vast differences in the socialization and life experiences of people with regard to gender. I am concerned that I might perpetuate this harm done by this practice if I keep on using his words rather than the word that is more commonly used today. So fair warning, I will say people, or a person, or a human being, where he more likely said man. Both I-you and I-it refer to different kinds of relationships between a person and something or someone outside of themselves. In Buber's I-you relations, he understands a dialogue to take place between two things, and I-it relations as a monologue, usually with oneself. To perceive the other as an it is to take them as a category, rather than as a distinct individual with characteristics of their own, unique to them, and not necessarily found in other individuals who might be similar to them in many other ways. In contrast, in an I-you relationship, both participants exist as whole individuals who can recognize each other's particular characteristics and whose center lies in between. It's quite intriguing, this idea of Buber's of a between. His emphasis shifts to the nature of the relationship between things, rather than to some notion about their individual nature or whatever they might be thinking or feeling. The I of a person is different in both modes of existence. The I of the I-it relationship is a partial human entity who focuses on their own wants and needs in their particular transaction of the moment. The I of the I-you relationship is a whole person who knows themselves as an individual in a relationship with another whole person. We need to understand the consequences of the nature of the relationships we choose and cultivate the ones whose outcome we want, because we are shaping our own identities with our choices. Now, Buber was pretty clear that both kinds of relationships are appropriate at different times. One is not better than the other. However, when people present themselves to the world, they do take up one of these modes. Again, it is not only important to understand the distinction and be aware of what relationship you are choosing, it may be important to understand why you are choosing that. Remember, with your choices, you are shaping yourself. Maybe it's time to unpack those things. For example, you may talk to your cat when feeding it, or when you're watching TV together, or when you're cleaning their litter box, but your relationship with your cat or other pet is probably I-it. You understand cat as a category of living being typically possessed of 4 legs, a tail, fur, whiskers, and a head, who purrs, sleeps a lot, and maybe likes to hop on counters and knock things off. None of this has anything to do with how much you like your cat, but it does make it harder to understand them when they do something outside of your idea of cat. Ask yourself, would I notice if my cat began to speak English or bake cookies? Would you notice anything they did that didn't come within the category you have for cat? To illustrate the point that assigning characteristics limits our ability to see beyond our expectations, let me tell you about a study of selective attention conducted at Harvard in 1999. In it, 2 teams conducted a drill where they repeatedly passed a basketball between them. Observers in the bleachers were asked to count the number of passes from their respective teams. The event was captured on video. At one point, a person dressed in a gorilla suit came onto the center of the basketball court, faced the video camera, and thumped its chest before it walked off the court. Fully 70% of the people in the bleachers did not see the gorilla. Most people think of themselves as being pretty observant, but psychological studies like this one tell a different story. Our expectations and what we're already giving attention to shape our awareness far more than most of us realize. All of us put some group of people into categories and hence are prone to missing important details about those people. Notice, without commenting, what images come to mind when I say, I'm going to list a bunch of words and I just want you to, in your mind, see what images come. Burglar, pediatrician, teenager, Republican, Democrat, man, woman, New Yorker, South Carolinian, investment banker, inner city resident, farmer, elder, child, Christian, Buddhist, anything else that you can think of. Our preconceived ideas about things can very easily get in the way of seeing the gorillas right in front of us. Ask yourself if you would notice anything about any of the aforementioned people that didn't come within the category you have for them. Our preconceptions about each other also limit the possibility of authentic encounters. We must be able to look past categories and see the whole human being, or non-human being, to move beyond I-it and into the I-you relationships that can happen in friendships and other more personal relationships. Carl Rogers, the 20th century psychotherapist that I mentioned earlier, considered acceptance of a person to be a precondition of an authentic relationship. Now, by acceptance, I don't mean approval. I think he would have made it pretty clear, even to a client, that racism, for example, was not good. But I also doubt that he would have refused to treat someone who slipped up and said or did something we would consider racist. Acceptance without some level of awareness of difference isn't terribly remarkable. It's most remarkable when you can accept someone who is different from you in some significant way. Accepting means you acknowledge their right to be different from you. It means that you can affirm the inherent worth and dignity of those with whom you disagree, even if you can't condone their behavior. I think Buber's ideas about the difference between those things we regard as it, or objects we use to gratify some need, and you, beings we see as whole and existing for themselves and not for our gratification, has implications for how we understand and live out our first principle. What does it really mean that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person? Do we really believe this for everyone? How about people who repel us, whose words and behavior horrify us? Do we have inherent worth when we're grouchy and hurt the feelings of those around us, or when our house is a sloppy mess of piles of paper, or when we forget to say please and thank you, or when we make a rolling stop at an intersection instead of coming to a complete stop? How about when we make little mistakes, when otherwise we cross every T and dot every I? Do I really have to be perfect to feel that I have inherent worth and dignity? The Merriam Dictionary says that inherent means involved in the constitution or essential character of something. If I can only believe in my worth when I do things that I'm happy with, then my feeling of self-worth is not inherent. It is conditional, or you might say a form of instrumental worth. I am affirming my instrumental worth when I have to perform well to feel okay. Things are deemed to have instrumental value if what they really affirm is their usefulness in achieving a particular end. I hope you don't believe that you have to be perfect to have worth and be treated with dignity. Maybe it's too difficult for you to truly affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. If you're afraid to do anything imperfectly, then you might be in an I-it relationship with yourself. And I'm imagining the same dynamic operates in your relationships with other people. It's pretty understandable that you relate to a bank teller as an it. After all, you're probably there to do a banking transaction and not to greet a whole person. But how often do you have encounters that you would describe as IU? Even Buber admitted that most IU encounters are brief, but it's worth wondering about. In a book called Our 7 Principles in Story and Verse, UU minister Kenneth Collier says of our first principle, sometimes affirmation and promotion require nothing more than listening and being in conversation. Sometimes it requires me to hold myself in respectful opposition to someone and to speak truths that are painful to myself or to others. And probably more often than I like to admit, it requires me to change my behavior, my way of living, my way of thinking about things. It requires me to admit that I have been wrong. I think I'll wrap this up with a return to the DeMello story that I opened with. Is it clear that the difference the way the waitress related to Amy and the way her family related to her, particularly her parents? We can probably safely assume that her parents loved her and that the waitress probably didn't. But I see the relationship between Amy and the waitress in that exchange as an IU one. Both the table conversation that excluded the 6-year-old and the way Amy's parents ignored her wishes and ordered for her sounded more like it. In that moment, they were relating to her as the category of dependent, rather than as a whole person with personal tastes and wishes of her own. Amy's statement that the waitress thinks I'm real sounds like the validation from the waitress both caught her off guard a little bit and maybe enlarged her view of herself and the possibilities available to her. We live in a culture that is quicker to find fault and punish than it is to understand and support. Changing that would involve a shift from almost exclusively I-it relationships to a greater portion of I-you. In the words of Reverend Jane Thixton from one of our congregations in Pittsburgh, the inherent worth and dignity of a person is no lightweight assertion. It is not something easily achieved. To affirm and promote the worth and dignity of everyone means believing everyone has it, and that can be quite difficult. The first principle is something to shoot for, to strive for, something that can challenge us and engage us and even frustrate us. This first principle is the very foundation of who we are as Unitarian Universalists. Coming out of a context of Calvinism, which believed only an elect are saved and the rest of us go to hell, Unitarians lifted up humanity because they saw the divine principle in all human beings. And my response to that is, as difficult as it often is to listen intently and see the whole person before you, rather than the category you usually relegate them to, it gives dignity not only to them, but to ourselves. May it be so.